Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for what will be an informative and behind-the-scenes view of what worked, what didn't work, and what we can learn from the Ontario election last month. I'm Pam Sugerman, Dean of the Faculty of Arts at Toronto Metropolitan University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this 23rd, it's hard to believe it's the 23rd Democracy Forum in the Faculty of Arts. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land on which the university is situated. Toronto Metropolitan University is on the territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. It is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, Treaty 13, and the Williams Treaties. Like many others in the TMU community, I continue to reflect on the meaning of land acknowledgements, particularly in light of our own reckoning with this university's history of colonization. And this is a history that exists, of course, not only in the past, but very much shapes the present day. As an academic leader, and more personally as a Japanese Canadian woman whose family was interned in this country, I'm committed to deepening my understanding of Indigenous knowledge and culture, promoting Indigenous education, and importantly, playing a role in creating the institutional conditions, or maybe breaking down some of the institutional conditions that exist and paving a way for Indigenous self-determination. As our regular attendees know, the Democracy Forum brings together speakers with different political perspectives to address timely, current social and political issues. And while the results of the provincial election may have been settled, questions about how to foster a more vibrant and equitable democracy remain with us. So in this event today, our panel of experts will address issues of strategy, impact, public dialogue in the recent election, the substantive issues that shaped the campaigns, and not to mention the issues that were not addressed or remained marginal to the campaigns. I'm now pleased to introduce our host and founder of the Democracy Forum series here in the Faculty of Arts, Toronto Star columnist and visiting practitioner in arts, Martin Reg Khan. Most of you are no doubt familiar with Martin's work, including his political column for the Toronto Star, in addition to all of the work that he produced during his 11 years, I'm dating you, Martin, 11 years as a foreign correspondent, years during which he held the position of Chief of the Middle East and Asia Bureaus. Martin is also Senior Fellow at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Martin, I'll now ask you to step onto the virtual stage. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Sugerman. Welcome to the Democracy Forum at TMU. Just 3 weeks ago, Ontarians voted in the provincial election, and the big news is that we had a clear winner, and no one seriously challenged the result. By today's standards, by American standards, that is big news. It's considered a victory for democracy. But as Pam was saying, that doesn't mean everyone is happy with the outcome. Today, we have campaign strategists from the four major political parties here to tell us how they did it, how they did democracy as practitioners in the field on the campaign trail. We launched the Democracy Forum 4 years ago. We had the leaders of the four major parties on stage with us talking about democratic engagement. And you may remember we also had the campaign managers after. So we're having a bit of a reunion today. We're calling today's event a meeting of rivals. Before I introduce our guests, I first have a quick programming note for you. Corey Tonight, who ran the Progressive Conservative campaign, was supposed to rejoin us today, but he has fallen ill. And last night, he rather heroically texted me to say not to worry about him or today's event because he nominated his closest colleague in the campaign to fill in. And as we like to say in democracy, the show must go on. So let me introduce first Nick Kouvalis. Nick served as chief strategist and pollster for the Progressive Conservative campaign that elected Doug Ford as premier in 2018 and re-elected him in 2022. He's played a similar role in the mayoral campaigns of John Tory and before that for Rob Ford. He is a principal at the campaign research polling firm, and he's joining us now from Greece, the cradle of democracy, appropriately enough. So Nick, I guess you couldn't say no to Corey, so thank you for joining us and letting us interrupt your vacation. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Martin, and hello, everyone. It's nice to be here, and I'll do my best to fill in today for Corey and try to answer your questions.
Michael Balagus was the New Democratic Party's campaign director for 2022 and the 2018 elections. He has been the leader's chief of staff since 2014, and he held the same role for two Manitoba premiers and directed their winning campaigns for the NDP in that province. He has also advised the federal NDP, and my favorite part of his biography is that he worked overseas with the National Democratic Institute in Europe, doing God's work for democracy. Welcome back, Michael.
Thanks, Martin, and thanks for the invitation, and thank you, Pam, and all of the folks at the university for putting on this event. And I too will do my best to answer your questions as clearly and frankly as possible.
This is good. All right. Christine McMillan was the Liberal Party campaign director for election 2022. She was Secretary General for the party's 2020 and 2013 leadership conventions and worked in Ontario's Liberal government. She's a partner at Crestview Strategy consulting firm, also a fellow at Carleton University's graduate program in political management. Welcome to the Democracy Forum, Christine.
Great. Thanks, Martin. Thanks for having me today. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and much like my colleagues have said, I will do my best to unpack what I think happened in the last couple of weeks.
Oh, I'm feeling a lot of goodwill today. This is great. Okay. Becky Smith was campaign chair for the Green Party of Ontario in 2022. She also managed the 2018 election, which elected the party's first MPP, Mike Schreiner. She has been Mike Schreiner's chief of staff as leader of the Green Party and executive director of the provincial party. So welcome back, Becky.
Great. Thanks, Martin. Thanks to the university, and looking forward to this conversation today.
All right, I'm going to kick it off with a few topics, and then we're going to open it up later to the audience for more questions. Just use the chat function on Zoom. Don't forget to include your name so I can give you a shout out when I read out a question. Just a reminder, I like to this disclaimer off the top. This is not a news conference. I'm not going to play the aggressive reporter here. This is a democracy forum where we try to go a little more in depth, try to draw out the participants to give us more candid answers where you will hopefully share all of your trade secrets. Okay, so Nick, congratulations are due for another election victory, which means you also get the honor of answering first to the first question. Pretty simple. I just wanted to ask all of you, starting with Nick, what the difference was between 2018 and 2022. Some of you are returning to the fold. You were all active, I think, in 2018, one way or another. So what was different for you, Nick? And then we'll go around the table.
Well, this time we had the government for 4 years, so that was a big difference. Pandemic, and also the turnout was a lot higher in 2018. I think we've talked about this already. The change election, people wanted change. Lots of people wanted PCs, and lots of people wanted NDP in 2018, and that was different than this time. A lot lower turnout. And I know you're going to ask what that means, a lower turnout later, but yeah. Those are the big differences. In the last campaign, Dimitri Pantazopoulos was the senior pollster for the campaign. I was doing more of the vendor and data collection stuff, but from that perspective, we've had way more money this time than we did in 2018. So I was able to do about 7 or 8 times more research, and more. We did 3 or 4 times more voter ID, literally millions of dollars more. So that's a big difference.
And as you said, the last time was a change election. This time, so you wanted to push that change. This time, you didn't want a change election, and we did the opposite. Just briefly, Nick, before we go around, tell us a little more about your techniques, the trade secrets. I mean, I remember last time Corey talking about using the Xbox, kind of a pilot program, to use the little banner below the ribbon below the Xbox, which is that gaming device or screen, to promote Buck a Beer. And I think this time you were talking about building out highways. And so you used some different kinds of micro targeting, as you might call it, where you used the Waze mapping traffic app, so that people might be stuck in a traffic jam, and then they'd see your ad, hey, we can build more highways. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. We have the voters segmented into different groups. We know who is more prone to vote for us and who is not. We know we know the difference with which groups the Doug Ford PCs did well with in 2018 compared to Trudeau in 2021. Mm-hmm. So, for example, out of 7 different groups of voters, there's 3 groups that I would call nonpartisan, where the other 4 are more partisan, either center to the right or center to the left. And with the nonpartisans, Prime Minister Trudeau cleaned up against the Conservative Party of Canada. And in this election, we did well with them, and we did in the last one too. With respect to, once we know who they are, we're looking to find ways to reach them, whether it's a Waze app or specific podcasts or billboards on the highway, and then what message we're trying to deliver to the people we think, what the number one issue is for the people using each platform. So if you're driving on the highway, looking at a billboard during rush hour, they're seeing congestion and Highway 413 highways. If they're playing or if they're on listening to a podcast about sports, it might be something else. So.
Okay, Michael, you also for the months before the election, I would frequently get reminders from your team about how successful your fundraising was. Your party just demolished or really overtook the Liberals, and I think had a very broad base of donors as well. So you had more money to play with this time, and you had some more sophisticated polling, I suspect, than you ever had before. Tell us about just give us a bit of an overview about what was different for you this time versus last time.
I think Nick hit, the 2 big things that were different are clearly 2018 was a change election. That is huge. It's a very, very different campaign. And then the second one, of course, is the pandemic. And those things dramatically changed on their own, 2018 versus 2022. So those were the big differences. The party did have more money this time around than ever before, and it did allow us to do some things that we hadn't in the past. I think we had a much more sophisticated, Nick touched on it, voter modeling than we ever had before, and included what we were able to add to our voter modeling this time around was the media consumption. So we were able to take a particular voter on a scale of, from 1 to 10, the likelihood of where their vote was likely to be, and more importantly, the likelihood of them voting. And then what we were able to layer on this time was their primary sources of information and media. And so that was extremely helpful. And increasingly so. I think it is very, very much going to be the future of campaigning. It is many of the traditional sources of information that voters rely on heading into a campaign just aren't there anymore. And it's that direct communication that is going to be more and more critical.
Okay, we'll turn more to the voter turnout actually very shortly, but let's park that question, and in particular, the extent to which you knew in advance or were able to get a feeling about what the voter turnout might be. Let's go to Christine. Tell us, the last election was a change election where the Liberals paid a price, and this election, you actually went up in your popular vote, I think from roughly 19 to 24%, but your seat count stayed roughly the same, 7 to 8. And in fact, your popular vote of 24 was lower than the polls, most public polling had predicted. So what changed for you this time?
Yeah, so I think for me, I wasn't involved in the 2018 election. My last central campaign would have been 2011. So I did all of the McGinty's. And then I took a bit of a break, and then I came back to do this one. And so for me, this cycle was the opposite of what Michael and Nick are talking about, right? I came to something where we had no resources, where we just spent a cycle being out of government, and not just out of government, we didn't have party status, which we still don't. And so we didn't have any of the Caucus Service Bureau, any of the things that I'd sort of grown accustomed to having as a bit of a resource base or something to kind of back you up. So it was apple for me, it's an apples to oranges comparison in terms of what this campaign was like compared to other campaigns for me. And I also think too, we had, talking about not having a large caucus, that also meant we had to go out and recruit over 100 candidates, right? Which is something the Ontario Liberal Party has never had to do before. And so we were starting from 7, and we needed to get to 124. So that was a huge lift for us without any resources to kind of find our candidates. And I also think too, we had a brand new leader, whereas the other 3 had leaders who were more established. So we were sort of starting from behind on that. And to, what Nick had said too, the leader going in had also spent a cycle with all the resources of government, right? And so while that presents challenges, it's hard to campaign when you also have to run a government. You also have all of the benefits of coming out of that. So for me, it was a big, big difference in terms of what we had and also sort of what we needed to focus on and sort of that near term. And also too, my last point on that too, just from the differences too, is like Stephen had 2 years as leader going into the writ, whereas the other folks had a significant amount more time.
Yeah, so name recognition was a challenge. Let's go to Becky. What was different? 2018 was the breakthrough year for the Greens. This year was supposed to be the time that you would grow from 1 seat to 2 or more. Tell us about the difference.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. Definitely from 2018, having Mike in the legislature, building reputation, putting forward policies, lots of things we had never been able to do before 2018, and also growing the party. So we ran the biggest campaign that we ever had in history. So that's great. We did grow in this election. So Mike got elected again, and we grew our vote share overall and our vote total by a little bit. You are right that we didn't quite get the second seat, but we were very competitive and pretty close to doing that. I think, other changes for us, the leaders debate, this was the first time Mike was included, and we were included in the leaders debate, and Mike was fantastic. And we heard that at the doors, as well as, the buzz online and from others. We were hearing, oh, I really like your leader. He's fantastic. It does take time to build trust with voters. So that is just the first shot, and we'll have another chance in 4 years.
I was going to talk about the debate later on because I do want to talk about voter turnout earlier, but let's just jump on that one. So I don't want to provoke the other 3 because everyone's being gracious and well behaved today, and I have to be as well. But there's a feeling that Mike Schreiner won that debate. That's not my question. My question is, why didn't it help the Greens more? If debates are so important and Mike Schreiner seemed like the nicest guy, even when he was criticizing the others, why didn't that translate? Becky, quickly to you, and then just see if the others want to bite.
I'm glad you said he won, because I was going to say that, but didn't want to start anything here. But he had a great debate. It did help. We saw trend lines moving up in various metrics, fundraising, and of course in Perry Sound Muskoka, where we placed a very close second, we saw that make a difference.
But why didn't it help more?
I think it's because of what I mentioned before, and that it takes time. We knew how great Mike was, how articulate he was, what a strong leader he is, but Ontario didn't, and so that was the very first time for them. So it was a little bit of a too big of a leap this time, but I think it gives us opportunity to grow.
All right, I've given you a lot of airtime there.
Thank you.
To cheer him on. Anyone else want to bite about the debate generally, though? We talk so much about the debate as a way of engaging voters, as a way of holding the leaders to account. So are they overrated? I mean, I'm not making the argument against debates. I passionately believe they are core, but do they change anything other than a big blooper? I mean.
Yeah, I think that they a blooper is the thing everyone watches out for, right? Is who's going to actually lose the debate and kind of fall flat on their face. I think what was interesting to me about this debate is I think the expectations were quite low, I think, for Stephen. And I think I knew that Stephen would do very well because I know how he's smart and he's articulate, and he did the work and he was well briefed and all of that. But I think and I think he did very well. And I think the timing of the debate worked in Ford's favor, right? Because I think it got out at the front end of the campaign. I think the long weekend was coming up. So people saw the debate, saw everybody did okay, and kind of went off and kind of continued on their lives, right? So that was sort of part of it. And I also think, when Becky was talking about how well Mr. Schreiner did in the debate, I also think the format helped Mr. Schreiner because he had I think he had 2 one-on-ones with Ford, right? Which was sort of gave him the opportunities to kind of take those punches and get himself really into the story. So I think sometimes the format has a big impact on how the debate kind of rolls out.
Okay. Michael or Nick, are debates overrated in terms of the democratic process? I mean, as important as they are conceptually, do they move the needle much? Again, setting aside some crazy blooper or some overwrought knockout punch. But if there's just a civilized debate that talks about the issues and everybody does reasonably well, does that move the needle?
I'll take a stab at it. And then, I think it depends on the campaign. If there's a campaign where there's a high level of interest and people do tune into the election as the starting point, which we didn't see in this campaign early, then the debate takes on a greater significance. For the most part, people don't watch the debate. Coincidentally, we had scheduled a series of focus groups the day after the debate, not to measure the debate, but just as part of it. And I think on that day, about roughly 24 Ontarians we talked to, and not a single one had seen the debate. Not one of the 24 people that were in our groups. In the old days, when people followed mainstream media more than they do today, they would get some impression of the debate, but even that is happening less and less and less, and then more and more the views are fragmented. So I think, and then the last thing is quite frankly the notion of a debate. There was no knockout punch, there was no setting it up like a wrestling match. It's like people kind of just starting to roll their eyes at stuff like that. So I think debates are important, and I think in some campaigns and some debates are incredibly important, and you've actually seen elections turn on those. I think going forward, you're going to see that less and less and less, I think, for a whole variety of reasons. But I think the reason for this campaign, I think the low interest in the campaign, and to Christine's point, combined with the debate coming early, interest did pick up in the campaign post-long weekend. People did start paying attention post-long weekend, but that front 2 weeks, you couldn't find anybody who knew there was an election on.
Thank you for raising that, Michael. A really good point. And as I recall, I saw some other polling data that might have been optimistic, overstating it, that maybe 1 in 10 Ontarians either watched the debate or caught parts of it. Before I forget, I have a note from Rianne and John, who's helping to remind everyone. I think I said the chat function, if you do have a question, use the Q&A function on Zoom to pass your question to us. So that's interesting about the debate. I want to just ask, before I forget, Christine, how long did Stephen Del Duca spend on debate prep? When did he start? Like a year ago, longer? How long back did that go?
So yes, happy to answer that. So we started almost immediately, just because we knew we were going into this, as I said, as the unknown leader, right? So no one had seen Stephen perform before. And so we knew it was important that he was ready. And that's also just Stephen. Stephen's always ready. Like he is one of those people who takes a brief very well, understands things quickly, asks a lot of questions, which can be, frustrating when you're the person trying to get him ready. But so it was something we started right away. And the other reason we wanted to start right away is that we also knew we don't have the resources to compete, right? We're not going to have a big air war and all that stuff. So we knew it was really important that he have a solid performance so that we could kind of shoot that out as organically as we could through our digital channels.
Okay, so that's a big investment, like a year and a half or longer in a debate that Michael is saying not many people in his focus group watched. So let me segue from that lack of interest, that lack of engagement in the debate, which for many of us still has this special luster of being the focal point of the Democratic arena. And I will agree that concede that most of my colleagues overdo the wrestling match and the boxing metaphors. I personally try to avoid them, but something seems broken. Setting that aside, let's talk about the turnout and the lack of engagement and interest per se. We talked about it in 2018 when the leaders came together. It was to talk about engagement, and the vote did go up. We can claim credit for that, but I think it was really just a change election. So in 2014, I believe the turnout was about 50%. In 2018, it went up 7 points. And everyone's worrying about Democratic engagement, but it actually went up in recent history, very recent history, by 7 percentage points. And then it tumbled down to 43% in this last election. So what happened? Nick, why don't you take us through that? I guess change elections motivate people, but how do we go to these massive oscillations in turnout? How do you explain it?
I think we just spent 2 years in a pandemic, and people, and after each wave of the pandemic, we conducted research to find out what generally people wanted. And we were looking at what generally people who might vote for us or people who would not vote for us. I didn't really care to look at what they wanted. I wanted to look at, of the 70% of the population that might vote for us, what were they interested in? And they were interested in getting on with their lives, getting on with it. And that's how we got to get it done as our slogan. That's how we found our way there. I just think, like, one day the leaders are wearing masks, the next day they're in a crowded room, they're not wearing a masks. The media that's screaming bloody murder about everyone should be wearing a mask all the time is organizing a debate in a shoebox where everyone's shoulder to shoulder, no one's wearing a mask. And I think people have just had it with all of us. All of us. They're just tired. Let's get on with it. Who's going to get it done? Get what done means something different to a bunch of people. Doug Ford ain't so bad. The others would have been not much better. I'm going to just vote for him or not vote against him. That's what I think happened in this election.
People were disengaged, frustrated, and wanted to look forward, not backwards.
Yeah, that, and Doug Ford performed really well this time out, and that certainly helped us get from 76 to 80 seats, right? So that helped us a lot, his performance. But the other leaders were pretty good. Like on the point of Mr. Shiner winning the debate, I watched the debate. I thought he won the debate, but only 15 people in the whole province watched the debate. So the polls all said that Doug Ford won the debate, right? That's what people thought or heard or whatever.
Michael, there's a lot of disappointment, which I share, about the low turnout, and you see some people suggesting that somehow diminishes Doug Ford's mandate, that he may have gotten 43% of the vote, but people have done the math and said, well, since only he got 41% of the popular vote, but since only there's a turnout of only 43% of the 10.5 million people who are eligible, if you do the math, he actually only got 18% of all eligible voters, those who voted and those who didn't. Do you subscribe to that? Do you believe he has a diminished mandate because of the turnout being so low and it's somehow less legitimate?
I would start by saying most mayors in Ontario don't have that kind of that level of support, and nobody challenges their right to be mayor. I mean, it's
absolutely right.
I find it discouraging, but it is the system. It's a legitimate election, and then I think, just to go back to your earlier question and some of Nick's comments, I mean, I think there are some structural problems in terms of turnout that continue, and you see over and over again. I agree with you 100%. There's nothing brings voters out like a hanging. So when you get a throw the bump election, everybody comes running to it. This was not that election. I think Nick is absolutely right on the pandemic. I have a little bit different take than him, that people were just really excited and happy with what the government did. But I think for the most part, it was, I just came through a pandemic. All I want to do is get my life together again. I think most people would have just been happy to say, do we really have to do this election now? Like, I am sorry, that's not my focus. I got my kid back in school. I got my job again. This is, I got no time for this. So I think that was a unique circumstance this time around. I think Elections Ontario has a lot of work to do in terms of its role. And it's something that's not regularly discussed. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about how uninspiring politicians are and how terrible our platforms are and all those things. But I think that there's some real systemic problems with Elections Ontario. They should leave Canada for a weekend and go watch how elections are run around the world. We must be the last, us in the US, the last people on earth that have a one-day election. I mean, elections should be, in my view, and you touched on some of my earlier work, and I did a lot of work in developing democracies, and elections are done over 2 or 3 days, including one weekend day. Like a Sunday, Monday is a great way to run an election, and just giving the people the ability to vote. And then the third thing on turnout is just the increasing cynicism. And I think what I've found, I've been doing this for over 35 years, and people just are believing less and less that government can actually make a difference. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. And there are a whole bunch of people responsible for that attitude developing. But increasingly, people are looking and just saying, like, you can't fix it. Like, you know, talk about it, but government can't do it. And I think that's the thing that is hurting turnout, is that cynicism.
Christine, you paid an extra price in terms of what seemed to me to, if the public polling was right, that even though you got slightly more than the NDP on the popular vote, a fraction of a percentage, it was lower than the polling had suggested. Never mind the seat counts. There was a lot of debate about where you would land on seats. But in terms of the popular vote that people look at, people were saying you'd be sort of in the high 20s, 27, 26, 28, and you ended up with just under 24, I believe. So you got hit by a particularly low turnout. What do you think happened?
I think in that last week, you know, I think we just got squeezed, right? I think we got squeezed on both sides. And I think that, you know, from my perspective, our first sort of 10 days were quite strong. And I think we came out of the gate with put some interesting ideas in the window. People were responding to it. And then people sort of stopped responding to our policy, I think. And they stopped and then I found that people, you know, to what everyone else is saying, it was difficult to engage people and difficult to have those conversations and difficult even to pull our own voters out on election day. Like some of our candidates were telling me stories about they're at someone's home who had a sign for them on their lawn. And they were like, okay, you've got an hour to go. The polling station's just down the street. And they were like, oh, you know what? Doug Ford's already won. So I'm going to go barbecue in my backyard. It's a nice night. And so we found too, that a lot of people thought it was over before it began. And while we care a lot about, you know, who comes in second and how many seats so-and-so has and all that kind of stuff, the average person does not, right? They care about who's the premier and who's the government.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, actually. We did tend to focus on who would come second because first was a foregone conclusion, but that's not top of mind for the average voter. It's like second or third.
We care, but nobody else does, right?
Yeah, fair point.
So it's hard to motivate people to take a night. It was a lovely evening. So it's hard to motivate people to stop their barbecue or stop playing at the park with their kids when they felt it was already done.
Unless, as Michael says, there's a public hanging and then people are more inclined to come out. Becky, let's put the squeeze on you here. Do you believe that changing to proportional representation or some form of it, mixed member, whatever, would dramatically or significantly increase the turnout? Never mind helping the Greens, because I think we would agree with you on that. But are you going to argue today that PR, proportional representation, is the panacea for a low turnout?
Well, I think I agree with a lot of what's been said already in terms of the election we found ourselves in. And in terms of, you know, the things I heard, I had a neighbor stop me on the street the couple of days after the election to tell me they didn't vote. I was like, I'm not sure I'm the person you should be telling this to, but I want to hear about why. And so they were just, you know, just not inspired, but added to that they really felt that their vote didn't count. And in a proportional representation system, your vote it counts in a different way.
Okay, but I want to tell you because I don't want to spend too much time on PR. Do you think it would? Do you think it would? I know it would help you. Do you believe it would dramatically increase the overall turnout? People voting for the Liberals, Tories, and Democrats.
I do, because it answers the question of does my vote matter? Regardless of who you're voting for. Yeah.
Can I go around the table? Christine, Nick, Michael, would PR measurably, like significantly, because we see swings of 7% from one election to the next, 14% from this election to the last. So those are big swings already. Would PR give us another 20 percentage points and bring us into the 70s or the high 60s?
Yeah, I'm not
Anybody?
sure that I think that it would increase it, because I think Becky's right. I think people would feel more that their vote counted. But I think, and I do think we need to look at the system, right? And I don't know the answer to what would make people come out more to vote. I don't know if it's PR or if it's a mixed system or something else. But I do think that there is merit in looking at it.
You had a ranked ballot as your in your window for electoral reform. That didn't seem to get any traction. Is that idea dead?
Well, I mean, what Stephen said is we'd bring in the ranked ballot. We'd also bring in a citizens assembly to take a look at all these different sort of methods. We're not experts, right? So I think to Becky's point, if people feel more engaged and that they have, something that they the ability to impact change, I do think they would come out. That's just human nature, right?
Nick, Michael, any thoughts?
I don't think it would substantially, and we had it in our platform. I mean, we have a member proportional representation in our platform.
That's right.
My own personal view is I don't think it would dramatically increase voter turnout. I think there are some ridings where people say, look, the Liberals always do this by 40 points or the PCs or whatever, so why bother? But I have run into very, very few voters when I ask them, why didn't you vote? Well, because my vote doesn't count, and if I had proportional representation, I would have voted. That is, I've run into very, very few people where they tell me that's the reason they didn't vote, because they felt their vote wouldn't count. They generally have more reasons. I think there would be some increase, but I don't think it would be the kind of dramatic increase that you were asking. Or
yeah. When you were in Manitoba, you were running the government as chief of staff, not running it, but you were in government. Did you ever come close to bringing in proportional representation when the NDP ran the Manitoba government?
No.
Sorry, no.
I said no. Sorry.
Oh no, that's a no. Okay.
No, it was never a huge issue, never a big push, and you got to remember, like the difference too. Like Ontario is increasingly a very unique place in terms of having a three-party system.
Yes.
With respect to fourth party, but three main parties rivaling, like that is most of Western Canada, all of Western Canada are two-party systems. Increasingly Atlantic Canada is two-party systems, and that's a very, very different kettle of fish.
Quite right. Nick, what do you think?
No, I don't think PR would drive turnout out. I think change, scandal, at this point in time, we were the only party, I think, communicating at a very effective way about rebuilding the economy, creating jobs, bigger paychecks, right? Better jobs, bigger paychecks, and that kind of stuff. I thought we did a really good job on that. Where the other parties, if we're talking about what they want us to talk about, which is long-term care and healthcare and education, then we're losing. And people's minds just weren't there as much as the key drivers of vote. We found in our research where the things I mentioned at the outset, those other things are also important, just not as important to about 50% of the population.
So just briefly, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but it is a question on many people's minds. Why was COVID and healthcare not a bigger issue? When I asked Andrea Horvath in an interview in the campaign what the ballot question was for her, Michael, she said healthcare. For Doug Ford, it was obviously affordability. And for Stephen Del Duca, he also said affordability. If I'd asked Mike, he would have said climate change. But why did COVID not predominate? It got a bit of traction in the debate and some of our coverage. And when the leaders got COVID, that was in the news for a while and had a bit of an impact as a talking point. But why didn't it take? And maybe I'll start with Nick and ask, did you kind of inoculate yourselves in some way when you expelled one and then two and then three members of your caucus for not getting vaccinated or not disclosing their vaccination status? Did you push the issue away? Because the federal Tories didn't do that.
They didn't do it. I mean, I don't think the federal Tory leadership even could tell you how many of their caucus members were or were not vaccinated, let alone they were afraid to even go ask the question. So
So
yeah,
why weren't you afraid, and why did you act on it?
because we had 70 something members, and you only need 63 to have a majority. So you might as well just cut your losses quick and right, burn out the bleeding and move on. It sounds rough and terrible, but that's my advice and Corey's advice. And frankly, the chief of staff and the principal say our advice to the premier and the leader of our party was, you're going to get slaughtered if you keep these people in your caucus, right? So if they don't want to get the vaccine because they have some objection, that's great. That's their choice. And they can't be in our caucus, right? So
And did that push the issue aside for you?
Yeah, it definitely pushed it inoculated us there. You know, when I was measuring every single week, pandemic management and the government, right? Too much, too little, enough, all that stuff. You know, he was getting 55% of the voters outside of those two periods, right? April to 2021 and January 3rd, 2022. Outside of those 2 weeks, 3-week periods there, he was getting over 50% score on that. And no one knew who Stephen Del Duca was. And if the Liberals did have, you know, $15 million more, that might be a different story. I definitely didn't assume we were going to win the election. We took it very seriously. We thought Del Duca was going to come up and we were going to be going toe to toe with him. So we took it very seriously from that perspective. But yeah, I think we inoculated ourselves well. I think there's a huge bubble of climate emergency people and, you know, social justice warriors, and a whole bunch of them are in the media. And there's this whole narrative that's created about how bad conservatives are and how bad Doug Ford is. And I think that was just a huge mistake that some of the other parties bought into that a little bit too much, because the general public actually thought he did a pretty good job. And relative to Legault and relative to Jason Kenney and relative to Andrew Scheer and relative to Aaron O'Toole, he was doing a pretty good job.
Just briefly, Nick, before I go to the others, did the other two parties, were they fighting the last four? Were they fighting 2018 or not quite?
Yeah, look, I don't, and again, I'm not trying to be critical, and the audience wants to hear. So, you know, I think one of the big mistakes the Liberals made was making this Del Duca versus Ford. Had they gone brand versus brand, team versus team, I think they would have done better. People really underestimate Doug Ford. They underestimated Rob Ford, right? They underestimate me. They underestimate Corey. They underestimate a lot of people on our team, right? We never looked at Stephen Del Duca. I mean, I know what we were hearing about Stephen Del Duca in the focus groups and Andrea Horvath. Some of it wasn't nice, but we never walked out of those focus groups saying, yeah, that's right. These people are, you know, big losers. We said, we're not going to underestimate these guys. But I think the other guys underestimate Doug Ford too much. And if I was running a campaign against Doug Ford, I would have run it against brands, for sure.
You would have run it, sorry?
Brand on brand, team
on brand. Okay. Michael, can you talk a little bit about healthcare? I don't think the NDP gets enough credit for having made healthcare a major issue in 2018 when a lot of journalists weren't paying attention. Michael, you have a background also working for the Nurses Union. You're in Manitoba. You understood the importance of this issue. You talked a lot about long-term care in 2018. It didn't get much traction. You talked a lot about it this time as well. In fact, for the last 4 years, it's been many years now, and it didn't seem to take. What's your assessment of why COVID and healthcare weren't as predominant as you might have hoped?
I'm not sure I agree it didn't take. I mean, the thing in campaigns is that you very much, like you talked about the ballot question, and every party drives towards a ballot question they think they can win. And he who gets there wins. And I think that's so for us, healthcare was very, very important in allowing us to hang on to 31 seats and to build forward. If we had run on who's going to make life most affordable for you, the NDP and Andrea Horvath or Doug Ford and the Conservatives, we probably would have 6 seats today. Regardless of what the truth to that answer is, if we can debate forever, people don't buy it. So, you know, so what do they buy? Well, they buy that there's a huge problem in healthcare, and the person I trust most to fix it is the NDP and Andrea Horvath, and that allowed us to get to the level that we were. And I think in terms of the pandemic itself, like 2 things. Number one is people wanted to move on. So to retry the pandemic was not necessarily a smart thing to do. And the other thing that we figured out very, very early is no one, we did a lot of work with conservative NDP cross-pressured voters. A lot of work, a lot of research, because we knew if we were able to go over the top, we were going to have to get some of them. Not a lot, but some. And what was very, very clear with those voters is that they were unwilling to blame Doug Ford for anything that happened in the pandemic. And they had lots of things that went wrong. They could give you a list this long of things that went wrong, but they were the fault of his bad advisors, his terrible cabinet ministers, the media, the doctors forcing him to do things. None of these were his fault. And to suggest otherwise, so you weren't going to move them. And I said at one point in time, just about a month before the election, if you're voting Doug Ford coming out of the pandemic, no campaign is going to change. You're voting for Doug Ford coming out of the campaign. Nothing is going to change that. And I think Nick's absolutely right. Doug Ford's personal brand was incredibly important in terms of the Conservatives' ability to win that campaign.
Let's go to an audience question here. Everyone talks about the low interest in this campaign. Do the opposition parties take any responsibility for that low interest? It seems to me that none of them did things to make people interested enough in change to make people interested. How do you respond to that? Why don't we go to Christine and Becky and give Michael the last word on that?
Sure. I think that, it's not for lack of trying, right? Like, I think we, on all the opposition sides, were trying to put things in the window that would be interesting to people and start some conversations. And what I found was that worked for about 5 days. And then it just became about the horse race, and it just became about the politics of it. We ran into some challenges with some of our candidates, and that became much more interesting than Buckle Ride or any of the policies that we were trying to talk about, or affordability. So I think that happened. And I also think, going back to what Nick was saying about the Premier's personal brand, I think that absolutely plays into all of this as well. And I think the Premier did a really good job of kind of creating his own Teflon in some ways. Like, something would come up, for example, they would have a candidate issue or another issue, and the Premier would just stand there and just say, no, he's a great candidate, done. And he wouldn't give anything legs. And so whereas we would respond to things and react and put stuff out, I think he just cut it off and was just like, no. And then because he cut it off, it didn't keep going. And so I think that was also that played into a lot of it as well, is his ability to kind of cut things off and keep it kind of on the frame that they wanted to fight it on, versus us trying to insert the frames that we were trying to talk about.
Yeah, I don't pretend to be a Doug Ford expert, but he does seem to have kind of two speeds. One is he gets provoked and he kind of loses it and reverts to more mercurial mode. But most of the time, he just kind of rolls off his back, and he just doesn't rise to the bait. And so it's interesting. People don't recognize that more and more. He just doesn't rise to the bait, and then the reporter doesn't have anywhere to take it after that. Becky, did you have any thoughts about that? About how that played out, the opposition's role?
Yeah, absolutely. Just agree with Christine. We all were trying, and in our case, I think we did inspire people. I know that we inspired people, but the lesson learned for us is it changing that inspiration into votes on E-Day, and it was. And I know we're all in the process of debriefing, and so we'll keep trying to figure out how to do better next time. Yeah, it was a tough election in terms of COVID making everyone tired, actually, including volunteers. There was, I'm not sure how the other campaigns found this, but it was a more difficult campaign to recruit and retain volunteers than I've ever seen in the past. And volunteers have a direct relationship to getting out the vote and inspiring their neighbors and colleagues. So I think there's something in there as well.
I suspect you're right, Michael. Let's ramp up the question by blending it with a new one. So, to what extent did the opposition bear some of the blame? But here's a question. I believe it's from Corey Brown. The NDP. It's a question for the NDP. Failing to speak to the alienation and disjointed loss of community that we're all feeling in the modern era, the Ontario NDP's campaign ceded room to right-wing populism over the last 2 years. The pandemic was and is the perfect opportunity for the party to speak to the social and economic concerns of the working class, whether they are professionals or factory workers, unemployed people, migrant workers, and so on. What do you think? How do you respond to that?
Well, that's $1 million question. I mean, I think the first thing is that there's a whole big difference talking directly to working class blue collar individuals about their lives and an offer for them, which is way different than an intellectual debate about class and redistribution of wealth, etc. And the NDP is great at that second piece. We're fantastic at it. Nobody does it better than us. What we're increasingly having trouble doing, and not just us, I would argue it's right across North America, a wide swath where progressive parties are finding it increasingly difficult to connect and communicate directly with blue collar, everyday workers on the issues that matter most to them. And quite frankly, what matters most to them, and I will say 100% hats off, bigger paychecks and that's what they want. And that's what they want. And communicating those kinds of things in a direct way in terms of what matters to them. I think that's the challenge. I think it's which is the audience. And if the question is, could we have advanced a greater social justice agenda? Absolutely. Would that have got us working class blue collar voters? Probably not.
Yeah, and in Michael's defense, not that he needs me to defend him, but in America, they are grappling with that problem where the Democratic Party is losing out to this rich guy named Donald Trump, and you see it in France as well with the far right grabbing onto the working class that the socialists might assume was theirs. Can you just briefly explain, Michael, to the audience? I still grapple with this, I struggle with this. What is this? And Nick can join in after. What is this NDP PC switcher, the voter who switches between the right-wing Tories and the left-leaning you Democrats? How does that make sense? How do you go from one side of the spectrum to the other, Michael?
Well, why do I have to go first? I mean, we do share. I mean, I used to laugh years ago when I worked in Ottawa. I used to laugh at, up until the Charlottetown Accord, we had a lock hold on the "I hate everything" vote. We were the people who hated big business voted for us. People who hated everything. Like we were a very, very big protest vote, and some of that's changed over the years. But I think that in essence is the Conservatives and us, is that people do see us when they are frustrated, when they do feel no one's listening to them. They're more likely to gravitate towards either us or the Conservatives, and I think that's where the crossover comes. It doesn't come on ideology. I mean, that's not what it comes on. And very much, it's quite often, do you listen to me? Do you hear me? Do you treat me with respect? And I think those are the kinds of things, and that's where that crossover can happen.
And one of the raps against Kathleen Wynne, I think sometimes unfairly, was that she and her party weren't listening, and that's what Stephen Del Duca tried to remedy in his campaigns. Briefly, Michael, do the Greens get in the way of your appeal to protest voters?
Not at all. It's a whole different set of the number of cross-pressured NDP Green voters are pretty minimal. I mean, it's really a significant piece of our campaign.
Interesting. Nick, can you explain why you and Michael are proverbially in bed together when fighting for the blue collar vote, and how you've become perceived, perhaps I think a bit of an exaggeration, as the big blue collar machine? How is that? How can people go from Michael to your campaign and back?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the Ford brand. As everyone knows, I've started working with them in 2010 on the Rob Ford campaign for mayor. These guys and girls in that family are not afraid to get their hands dirty. They're not afraid to dig a ditch. They're not afraid to work all day lugging boxes out of one building into a truck, and they're not afraid to work. And that helps a lot. Right? I have complained over the years when I work with Liberals on campaigns that they are really good in the room, they're smart, right? When it comes to like actually physically doing crap jobs, They don't do them. That's us. That's who we do them. And you know, I can relate to all of this because I worked at Daimler Chrysler. I worked on the line. I went to school to become a journeyman, tool and die, right? And so finding a way to work with Trudeau to get federal government to accomplish what they wanted when it came to clean steel and it came to EV batteries, getting them showed one side, which is we can work with the other guys and to get things done. But it also helped us make significant, extraordinary investments and attract billions of dollars of private investment in key areas like Windsor, Oshawa, Brampton, Hamilton, and Niagara. And I think, you know, now if the premier and his cabinet work really hard to keep a lot of these promises and keep working with those more blue collar workers, you know, I think St. Catharines, Niagara Falls, Niagara Center, Oshawa, one or two more in the north, Windsor to come, Windsor West, those are going to come to us, I think, in the next election, barring some great.
And you did well in Windsor. You're from Windsor, but and you took some seats from the NDP in Windsor, as I'm sure Michael will acknowledge. Here's a quick question I want to throw at you guys as we slowly run out of time. Do you think having a person of color leading one or more of the opposition parties would push more people to be engaged and vote? Christine, why don't you take that first?
Yeah, I mean, representation matters, right? And I think seeing yourself reflected in your leadership is really important. And I think that, you know, I think when I look to the leaders that we recruited to, you know, who ran under Stephen's banner, like it was really important to us that they were diverse, not because, you know, because they just bring so much more to the table, different views, different ideas, different ways of looking at things. So I think it's important for sure that that people feel reflected.
And Michael, what about for the NDP in the leadership race?
Yeah, no, I think I couldn't agree more with Christine. I mean, I think it's important people see themselves in the party. They see themselves in the leadership of the party. They see themselves in the staff of the party, the membership of the party. I think all of those things are critically important. Will they drive up turnout? I don't know. You know, I mean, we have experience. We have a federal leader who was the person of color, and you know, done very, very well. But you know, it's critically important, and I think the more work the parties can do. I mean, I'm very, very proud of the work that we did in terms of our the slate of candidates that we put forward. Hats off to the Liberals for the work that they did in terms of recruiting candidates, etc. And I don't know, I'm not as familiar with what the Greens were able to do, but people are taking it seriously, and they need to.
And the Tories have elected a large number of people of color and Black candidates to the legislature as well. And yeah, Michael, I mean, I think Andrew Horvath made it a priority and you did as well too. It was a very white party years ago, and it's much more diverse today. But as you said, Jagmeet Singh, who you worked with in Ottawa, is the face of the party federally, and yet the party only got 5 seats in the last federal election compared to something like 76 for the Liberals. So it's tough. Christine, I know you had to start from scratch, but you recruited a lot of candidates of diversity, and we've had some of them here at Toronto Met University on our shows, on our programs, and but they didn't get elected. That's always the challenge. I want to just quickly throw one more question and go into Cheetah to 2 minutes of overtime, because you talked about the issues and affordability, and Abacus Data did a poll that I found fascinating, where they asked voters to rank the most important issues, and reducing the cost of living, we'll call it affordability, was 63%, housing 41%, on the way down, and COVID was about 9th on that list at about 14% versus 63% for affordability. And reducing racism, 8%, sick pay and workers' rights. I wrote dozens of columns about sick pay and the minimum wage, and they were at 7% and 8% compared to 63% for affordability. Any thoughts about how that kind of changes the way the media and question period agendas versus what's on voters' minds? Nick, why don't you take that?
You know, I'm not surprised I haven't seen that poll, but I'm not surprised to see that. Like you know, the things on the bottom of the list that you mentioned just now, they look like they're not important, but they are very important. They're just not as important as if someone has two choices and they have a list of 8 things, they're going to pick affordability, cost of living, those things now. So the things on the bottom are relatively important, just not as important as the thing on the top of the list.
So it's
And I
about
think-
vote determining issues as opposed to the constellation of things I'm concerned about.
Yeah, but now the election's over, and now there's a whole bunch of things that have to get done in healthcare, in long-term care, in a lot of areas where the Tories don't normally do well on. And the Tories do really, really, really well on cutting taxes, but I don't think we're going to be cutting taxes, right? Except for what was in our budget proposed in April.
Yeah, you've cut more than enough, Nick, already. Thank you. All right, we are out of time, and I have found this fascinating, especially the fact that you are all very candid in talking about what's really animating voters, what's not motivating voters, and how the media and popular culture tend to focus on certain issues that aren't as important for many people. But as Nick pointed out, those issues don't go away. They still matter. So I am going to just say a very heartfelt thanks to our distinguished guests for appearing today, but also for doing your bit for democracy. It's not as easy as it looks, as I think you've all explained to it. And it's a tough game with winners and losers, and no matter how well you do, you can't control it. So thank you to Nick Kouvalis for the Progressive Conservatives, Michael Balagus for the NDP, Christine McMillan for the Liberals, and Becky Smith for the Greens. A big thanks to everyone who joined us today. And if you voted in the election, thank you so much for doing your duty for democracy when it counts. Quick special thanks to the Faculty of Arts for sponsoring today's event, the Dean, Dr. Pam Sugerman, and the team led by Rhiannon John and Joselle Gerardo. Stay safe, everyone. Stay tuned for our future democracy forums at TMU. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.